From the moment I was old enough to read romance novels, I believed that my wedding day would be one of the happiest days of my life. I had pictured the train of my gown sweeping across the grass, a soft breeze catching my veil, and my beloved waiting at the altar with tears shining in his eyes. No matter how much life tested my patience, that image remained. By the time I met Ryan, I was ready to believe I had found the person meant to fulfill my dream. He had this easy grin, an air of confidence that didn't tip into arrogance, and the kind of laugh you hear once and think, I want to make him laugh like that for the rest of my days. So when he proposed, I said yes with a heart so full that every other part of me felt weightless, like it was destiny. Emily, my best friend since high school, was the first person I told after Ryan slipped the ring on my finger. She and I had been inseparable from the moment she marched up to me at orientation, complaining about how the plastic chairs were going to ruin her brand new jeans. Emily was sharp-tongued, vivacious, and unapologetically honest in ways I often admired. We bonded over cheesy horror flicks and afternoons trying on each other's clothes. When she leapt into my arms at the news, I hugged her back just as tightly. Deep down, I had always assumed she'd be my maid of honor whenever I got married. She knew me in ways no one else did, my favorite foods, how to calm me down when I spiraled into anxiety, and the best times to push me out of my comfort zone. I never imagined those qualities might become weapons against me. My parents, too, were elated. They'd known Ryan's family for years. My father and Ryan's father were old fishing buddies who loved to tell the story of how they once caught a catfish the size of a toddler. My mother enjoyed hosting dinners for Ryan's family, always praising how polite and charming he was. I had grown up listening to them talk about what a stand-up guy Ryan turned out to be, how rare it was to see someone so committed to his job, yet so attentive to his partner. He wasn't perfect, no one is, but I trusted that the small disagreements we had were normal. In the grand scheme of things, Ryan seemed like the safe harbor I could anchor myself to. He knew my folks inside and out, and they adored him. Over the years, there was never any reason to suspect hidden truths swirling beneath the surface. Everything started shifting 3 months before the wedding. Emily began acting strangely distant. She'd cancel our meetups last minute, claiming work emergencies or exhaustion. Her text messages felt forced, short replies peppered with excuses. At first, I worried that she might be going through something personal. She'd struggled with bouts of depression in college, and I never wanted her to feel alone. But whenever I asked if something was wrong, she insisted it was just the stress of her demanding job. Meanwhile, Ryan was also spending more time away on late-night projects. I didn't think much of it because he'd always been career-focused, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind wouldn't be silenced. Still, I brushed it off, giving them both the benefit of the doubt. I told myself this was probably the normal hectic swirl before a big event, and that soon everything would settle back into place. One evening, I found myself alone at my parents' house, flipping through old photo albums. My mother had left them on the kitchen table, presumably to reminisce about all the milestones leading up to the wedding. Pictures of Emily and me in Halloween costumes, of Ryan holding our neighbor's puppy, of family vacations on the lake. As I turned a page, something slipped out, a receipt from a small local motel. It was dated a week prior. Curiosity snagged me. I had no reason to connect it to anything suspicious, but that voice in my head roared to life. Why was a random motel receipt between the pages of a photo album? Who had put it there? I checked the date and time. It coincided with one of Ryan's supposed late-night projects. The occupant's name was scribbled, but the print was faded. It took me a moment to read it clearly. It read R. Hayes. My heart lurched. Ryan's last name was Hayes. At first, I rationalized that maybe his father or brother had rented a room for some reason, but they lived in town, with no obvious need for a motel. My mind raced. I called Ryan, half hoping he'd laugh it off as some bizarre coincidence. But my call went straight to voicemail. I started to panic, remembering how he and Emily had been so distant lately. I tried pushing the thought away. Accusing my fiancé and best friend of cheating seemed like an unthinkable betrayal of the trust we'd built. But sometimes, the unthinkable is exactly what's happening. I checked the motel's address and saw it was just off a highway exit near Emily's workplace. My stomach dropped. That night, I barely slept, my thoughts spiraling around the fear that the two people I trusted most were lying to me. In the morning, I decided to confront the issue head-on. I drove to Emily's apartment, unannounced. My plan was to gauge her reaction, see if her eyes darted away when I mentioned the motel. But she wasn't home. Her neighbor said she'd left early, an overnight bag slung over her shoulder. Anxiety clawed at me. I dialed her number and got the same dead-end voicemail as with Ryan. Feeling like I was in the middle of a surreal nightmare, I headed to my parents' place for some kind of clarity. My mother was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared breakfast. I placed the receipt on the table and waited for her response. She glanced at it, then up at me, her face blanching. That was all it took. One look at her expression, and I knew. She wasn't confused. She wasn't surprised. She was guilty of hiding something. I confronted her. She didn't deny it. My mother, in the trembling voice I'd only ever heard her use when she was severely disappointed in me, admitted that she knew Ryan and Emily had been meeting behind my back for months. According to her, it wasn't anything serious, just a moment of weakness that they both regretted. She tried to downplay it, as though a clandestine affair were a minor slip, like forgetting to pick up milk from the grocery store. I felt my hands shake, my vision blur with tears of betrayal. When I demanded to know who else knew, she faltered, refusing to meet my eyes. My father had known, my brother had known, even my aunt, who'd always been my confidant, had known. They had all decided it was best to keep it from me, not to ruin the wedding. They believed they were protecting me, or so they said. I left the house in a rage, unable to look at my mother any longer. Everything I had ever believed about family loyalty shattered in that kitchen. My father tried to follow me out, but I slammed the door so hard the frame rattled. I got in my car and drove aimlessly, tears streaming down my cheeks, a mixture of heartbreak and fury. I couldn't call Ryan or Emily. I didn't trust myself not to scream uncontrollably. Instead, I parked by the lake where we'd spent so many summers. Memories of us roasting marshmallows and laughing by the dock flickered through my mind like ghosts. I stayed there for hours, letting the day shift into twilight. By the time the sky turned a bruised purple, I'd resolved that I wouldn't let them see me broken. They wanted a wedding? They would get one, but on my terms. Vengeance would be mine. Over the next few days, I went through the motions of wedding preparations. Everyone kept expecting me to melt down, but I wore a mask of composure. My father approached me repeatedly, trying to explain how he had just wanted me to be happy, that he believed Ryan's mistake was in the past. I nodded politely, letting him think I was swallowing his rationale. Inside, I felt like a statue carved from cold stone, analyzing every detail. Emily attempted to reach out, leaving messages that ranged from tearful apologies to desperate pleas to see me in person. I ignored them. I wanted her to wonder what I knew, how much I had discovered. Ryan, meanwhile, acted like nothing was wrong. He brought flowers, asked about seating arrangements, and tried to kiss my cheek whenever I flinched away. The performance was nauseating. Still, I kept my silence, carefully planning my moment. The rehearsal dinner was set for a cozy Italian restaurant where both families and our closest friends were invited. I wore a modest navy dress, not wanting to overshadow my real spotlight moment that was yet to come. People smiled at me as I arrived, but their eyes flickered with nerves. My relatives tried to act normal. Some even complimented me on how calm I seemed. Emily was there, sitting at the far end of the table next to Ryan. Her face looked pale, her usual vivacious smile replaced by a forced twitch of her lips. Ryan greeted me with open arms, and I let him hug me, noticing the slight tremor in his embrace. My parents hovered nearby, exchanging worried glances. This was it, the final act before the truth would crack wide open. I took my seat at the head of the table, determined to keep everyone in suspense. After the first round of drinks, toasts began. My father raised his glass, wishing me and Ryan a lifetime of happiness. My mother chimed in with a story about how I'd always dreamed of a big wedding as a child. Ryan's mother shared a fond memory of him as a little boy, determined to marry the neighbor girl with daisies in her hair. Everyone laughed on cue, but tension hummed beneath the surface. I could see it in their stiff smiles. Emily's eyes darted to me every few seconds, as if waiting for my condemnation. Ryan reached for my hand, lacing his fingers with mine under the table. I let him, even squeezed back for effect, though the contact made my skin crawl. They were all in for a show tonight. I just wasn't sure if it would be the one any of them expected. But vengeance never arrives gently. I stood up, clearing my throat as the lights flickered gently overhead. The restaurant quieted. Every gaze turned to me. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. This was the moment I'd rehearsed countless times in my head. I began by thanking everyone for their support, talking about how important family and friendship were. My voice shook with genuine emotion. I couldn't hide the heartbreak fueling every word. Then I turned to Emily, my voice catching in my throat. I told her how I cherished our years of closeness, how she had become like a sister to me. I saw tears pool in her eyes. She must have thought I was about to let bygones be bygones. But instead, I announced that I had discovered her affair with Ryan, that I knew all about the lies. A chorus of shocked gasps rose around the table. I felt alive. Emily choked on a sob, her face turning scarlet. Ryan jumped to his feet, sputtering denials that no one believed. The tension in the room exploded, relatives clamoring for an explanation. My father stood there, slack-jawed, while my mother pressed trembling fingers to her lips. At first, Emily tried to deny everything, but her feeble protest dissolved under the weight of my calm fury. I recounted how they'd hid at a motel, how my entire family had known but chose to keep me in the dark. I didn't scream or cry. My voice was low, resolute, the kind of rage that blisters the air. I told Ryan he could take his ring and shove it. Then I paused, letting the gravity of betrayal settle over everyone. The silence was deafening. This was my declaration that I would never forgive them, never move past their deceit. I reveled in their discomfort. And then my mother stood up, her eyes brimming with tears. She begged me to listen, her voice trembling. For a fleeting moment, I thought she might apologize, or at least acknowledge how horrendous it was to conspire in silence. But instead, she said she had something else to confess, something that would change everything. My heart hammered as she admitted that she'd had her own affair years ago and that my father was not my biological parent. A stunned hush fell across the room. I watched my father's face go ashen. Emily's shame-faced expression melted into sheer confusion. Ryan took a step back, probably relieved that the attention had shifted. I stood there, numb. My mother explained she had carried the secret for decades, terrified of destroying our family. She claimed her guilt over that might have influenced her decision to keep Ryan's affair hidden from me. I was speechless. My whole body felt disconnected, like I was an observer in someone else's nightmare. It occurred to me, in that charged moment, that everyone in this room had lied to me. My mother had lied about my paternity. My father had lied by omission. Or maybe he hadn't known either. Emily and Ryan had lied about their betrayal. Suddenly, the wedding seemed like the smallest detail in a vast tapestry of deceit. For a moment, I wondered if my father had known I wasn't his child all along. He looked shattered, tears gleaming in his eyes. Ryan stood there, hand half raised as if he wanted to comfort me but didn't dare. Emily's expression was a mix of regret and pity. The air felt thick enough to slice. Then, something inside me snapped. I refused to let anyone else control this narrative. My life was mine to reclaim. No more illusions. I turned to my father, my voice brittle. Did you know?" He opened his mouth, nothing but a croak escaping at first. Then he managed to say he had suspected something was off years ago, but my mother convinced him it was a baseless fear. The devastation in his face was palpable. Then I looked at my mother. She was sobbing, reaching out to me. I stepped back, my revulsion painfully clear. I told her that she had lost any claim to my sympathy when she conspired against me in my darkest hour. She tried to speak, but I raised my hand to silence her. No apologies could right this. I glanced at Ryan and Emily, two people I had trusted with my whole heart, only to be repaid with betrayal. The restaurant was dead silent, except for the distant clink of dishes from the kitchen. They all cowered quietly. I knew I had to make a clean break. First, I turned to Ryan and removed the engagement ring from my finger. Placing it in his palm, I told him we were finished. No ceremony, no happily ever after. He looked panicked, trying to mutter something about how it was just a mistake, that we could work through it. But I saw no remorse in his eyes, only fear of losing the future he had so carefully cultivated. Emily stood by, tears rolling down her cheeks. She stammered out an apology, but I cut her off. My resentment flared, the memory of our shared laughter now laced with venom. I told her that she was dead to me, that there was no coming back from this. My voice trembled, but not with sadness, rather with the rage that burned so hot it felt cold. I would bury my ruined past here. All eyes stayed on me. My father looked as if he wanted to speak, but the shock of my mother's revelation had gutted him. My mother reached for me, whispering that she was sorry, that she never intended to hurt me. Anger twisted in my chest, but I managed to tell her that I couldn't even look at her without seeing a lifetime of lies. I declared right then and there that I was leaving. The wedding was off, and I didn't know when, if ever, I'd be able to speak to any of them again. Some distant relative tried to calm me, but I brushed them away. With trembling steps, I walked toward the exit, the whispers and hushed cries swirling behind me. I felt betrayed beyond measure, but also strangely liberated, like a prisoner stepping into the sun after years of darkness. I refused to remain shackled by their falsehoods. I drove away from the restaurant, the cool night air slicing through my open window. My phone buzzed incessantly, calls from my mother, texts from Emily, voicemails from Ryan, but I ignored them all. I was done. In that whirlwind of betrayal, I discovered a seed of resilience. I didn't have a father, fiancé, or best friend I could trust anymore. Yet, for the first time, I felt a fierce sense of self-worth. No more illusions, no more dancing around other people's comfort. I found a motel off the highway, the same chain where Ryan and Emily had met in secret, and checked in alone. In that stark, impersonal room, I gazed at my reflection in the mirror. There were tears in my eyes and a searing pain beneath my ribs, but also a determined light. I still believed in love and family, but I'd forged them on my own terms. Strength flickered inside.